Good afternoon. I'm David Summers. I'm the publisher of the Long Beach Post and Long Beach Business Journal. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's live chat. I also want to say thank you to our sponsor for today's live chat, the Long Beach Data Center. And today we're joined by my colleague, Brandon Richardson from the Long Beach Business Journal, who covers a great many of areas, including goods, the port, and commodities. Our guest today is Mario Cordero, Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach. We're going to be talking all things today about this great economic engine of our city and impacts that COVID-19 has had in the industry and on our port complex. But before we get into questions, we're going to start with a quick video from the port about a milestone that happened just a couple weeks ago. So please take a look at that first. Thank you to everyone at the port for sending that over. A look at the One Aquila, a continuing introduction of new and larger ships continuing to come into the port and call on the port. That business continues. So right now, if you have a question, a live chat question that you'd like to send in, please send that into the questions below. Comments below, and we'll ask those of Mario Cordero, who is our guest today, Executive Director of the Port. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brandon Richardson, for first question. Go ahead, Mario. Brandon.
Thank you, David. Mario, before we get into the current state of the port, just a little background for our viewers who may not be familiar with the size and importance of the port and its role as an economic engine for the city, the region, and the nation. Can you tell us the importance of the port for the region and nation? For example, the percentage of U.S. goods that move through the port, the number of jobs tied to the port, et cetera.
Well, Brandon, thank you, first of all, for having me and giving me this opportunity to talk about the Port of Long Beach. And so with regard to the question, as people may know here in the city, the San Pedro Bay complex, the port complex, is the largest containerized port complex in the United States. So for the Port of Long Beach, again, as you adequately described, we're very key of an economic engine, not only to the local community, but to the nation. To give you a specificity in terms of what that is, we've had as much as $200 billion in cargo value that comes to this port complex, the Port of Long Beach. In terms of the jobs, per our recent economic impact report, 51 to 55,000 jobs estimated here locally just in Long Beach. At the regional level, upwards of 500,000, and with the state of California, 700,000 jobs directly or indirectly from this port. And as to the containerized cargo, the nation's imports, 40% come through this port complex here at the Port of Long Beach, and about 25% of exports come to this complex here. And last, in terms of giving a magnitude of the importance of the Port of Long Beach here, even in the global arena, the most important trade route for the United States, that is the trade route to Asia, is known as the Trans-Pacific Trade Route. And this gateway here is the closest gateway to that very important region. So needless to say, it's an economic engine that has impacts both in terms of volume, revenue, and jobs, but in terms of strategic connectivity with globalization and the global community, I'm very proud to have a staff to lead the charge in terms of the continued prosperity here of the Port of Long Beach for the city and, of course, the state of California.
Okay, so you mentioned the importance of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles as the gateway to the trade routes with Asia. Prior to coronavirus pandemic, trade was already disrupted due to a trade war with China, which began in July 2018 and continues even following the Trade One deal signed in January by President Trump. Can you talk a little bit about the continuing trade war and what the impacts and implications are of that?
Sure. First of all, in 2018, that marked a historical record for the Port of Long Beach, moving 8.1 million containers. So needless to say, in 2018 was our best year ever. As we approached 2019, we commenced to see the impacts of the trade war that, in my opinion, again, has had, as I said, an impact, and question whether or not, at least for the nation, at a time that we had a very good economy, whether or not that was the best course to take. And I'm talking about the continued raising of tariffs. The fact of the matter is China is the epicenter of global manufacturing. And as I said in my earlier comments, the Port of Long Beach is ground zero for China, trade with China. So needless to say, as we move forward with the trade war, the impacts more directly we're seeing here in Southern California. And those impacts as a result of the trade war was, in fact, starting to see a diminished volume with regard to the trade war itself. And of course, some concern with regard to the diminished incremental loss of market share. So it's very fair to say that as we move forward throughout the year of 2019, the industry, that is the trades and goods movement industry, was in a state of uncertainty. Because again, as we proceeded in that year, depending on the state of discussions between the two countries, the movement of tariffs was increasing. But then again, as we ended 2019, there was light at the end of the tunnel with the phase one resolution on December 15th of 2019, which of course presented a great opportunity specifically for exports. So the uncertainty did commence with the trade war, that's for sure.
We're speaking with Mario Cordero, Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach. If you have questions for Mario, if you're interested in what's going on at the port, you can add them to the comments. If you're watching on Facebook or Twitter or any of our social media platforms, send your questions in. We'll be sure to ask them to Mario. Brandon, go ahead.
So trade war continues. Negotiations are underway again, off to a rocky start, reports are showing. But now we have coronavirus compounding those trade issues. Can you tell us a little bit about what the virus is doing to the goods movement?
Sure. I think in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis followed, that is on the heels of the trade war, we've gone from uncertainty with regard to that trade policy to now what I've termed radical uncertainty now with COVID-19. And those impacts have been in three areas: volume, revenue, and of course the diminished presence of vessels in this gateway coming from Asia. So all that is concerning. But again, in the scope of things, the Port of Long Beach is doing reasonably well. We've been open for business. Cargo continues. And again, there's been, again, in the proper context for the United States, it's fair to say there's been 20% loss of container volume throughout the gateways in the United States. As to the Port of Long Beach for calendar year 2020, that is from January to the current time, year to year, that difference is a 9% loss. So in the scope of things, we're doing well. So, but those are the areas that most definitively we've been impacted, as I listed those three items.
Mm-hmm.
Mario, I have a quick question for you. You talked about the partnership, the San Pedro Ports Complex, that this isn't just Long Beach alone, that it's also our partners across the Bay in LA. I'm curious about your conversations with your counterpart, with Gene Soroka. I'm curious about are there things that are happening that are different in the Port of LA versus the Port of Long Beach right now? I'm curious about, say, like commercial tenants and rents, relationships with their city, relationships with tenants. What have your conversations with Gene been like? What's happening that's different over there than different here right now?
Well, first of all, as you may know, we've had a very good relationship with the Port of LA over the many years, despite the fact, again, the complex is divided into political entities, which works for both cities, absolutely. So I think we've had uh, great success in environmental initiatives, as people may know. But in terms of the specific COVID-19 situation, that collaboration and dialogue continues. I mean, I think in both cases, we've had volume losses. In both cases, the areas of impact are, identical. And with regard to what we're doing to cope with the COVID-19, we do have conversations with regard to how we deal with operational issues to benefit the port complex. And with regard to our respective leases and the governance of the complex, it's very, very similar. So I think on that note, I think it's fair to say that the impacts to the Port of Long Beach are the same as Port of LA. And, so I think, again, what's important is for us in Southern California to succeed in mitigating what those impacts are and maximize operational levels. We need to work together with regard to some areas of common ground, and that's what we're doing.
Thank you.
So earlier you mentioned just how many jobs are tied to port operations. Uh, do you guys have any idea how many jobs have been lost due to the downturn and corona?
Well, when you have, as a nation, 15% unemployment, uh, 300, or excuse me, 30 uh, millions of people that have now are on the unemployment line share. And as the U.S. Treasury paying 48 billion in unemployment claims, every industry has been impacted with this crisis. Now, fortunately for the port, again, as I mentioned, we're an essential operation. So with regard to the various shelter-in-place orders, whether at the local or at the state level, uh, we've been exempted. Yet, again, when we lose volume and when we lose revenue, it does have an impact to the supply chain. So if we start with, uh, the men and women who work on the docks, the first people who are in there in terms of loading and unloading containers as they arrive to the port and leave the port, there has been a reduction in terms of job assignments. And that reduction is anywhere from 15 to 25%, depending on um, a week period. Again, things change week to week, month to month, but it's fair to say that there has been loss of job assignments on the docks. And when that happens, again, given the impact on the supply chain, it goes throughout. So at this point, I cannot say that we've had significant losses in the supply chain. On the other hand, it is concerning given the direction in terms of how this virus, which has no borders, moves in a very precipitous way. So it remains to be seen in terms of uh, whether or not we have hit a peak in terms of those impacts. I think it's fair to say that at the end of the day, we're in this situation now in the long term in terms of the continued impact of COVID-19. So as far as the port administration, there has been no impact in terms of jobs. We continue to work 24/7. But again, with regard to the supply chain and the women who work on the docks, men and women, there has been an impact in terms of the reduction of job assignments.
Okay. For those who are still working down at the docks as well as in the on the administrative side, what safety measures has the port put in place to protect those employees as well as anyone down the supply chain?
Well, for the port administration, at this point, I can represent, we have sufficient amount of PPEs, personal protection equipment, in the form of masks, and for our employees that are on the field, our harbor patrol, our construction management people, and our maintenance people. We're at a point now that, again, the health of our employees is first and foremost. As to the men and women who work on the docks, that is in Port Complex, some time back, about a month ago, there was a agreement between the PMA and the IOWU to collaborate and work together to procure the sufficient amount of PPEs to protect workers. And again, that's first and foremost, not only with the Port of Long Beach, our administration, but in the complex with the marine terminal operators. Early on, of course, there was a challenge regarding the sufficient amount of PPEs. And again, the priority for that should be, as it should be, with the medical community, hospitals, and first responders. So I think the progress that we have made as a state, that is the state of California and here locally, under leadership of Mayor Robert Garcia, we are now at a point that we are in a good situation in terms of PPEs. However, I want to put an asterisk to that commentary, because the challenge is how we accumulate our inventory in the long run. Because again, we're in this for the long term. So as far as I'm concerned, the inventory of procurement of PPEs has to be now not just a 6-month goal and objectives, should be a 12-month inventory. So that continues, that's in progress. But to the question, we've done very well to make sure that the workforce is protected, because the health and safety of that workforce is of utmost importance.
Well, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap it up for today from that, just because we can't seem to resolve the technical issues. Sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions, but there's plenty of time to come back to those questions. So for all of us here at the Long Beach Post and Long Beach Business Journal, Brandon Richardson, thank you for helping us out with the questions that we could get to today. Thank you to our sponsor for today's session, Long Beach Data Center. And please join us again tomorrow at 1. Have a good afternoon, everyone.